Hello and welcome. My name is Carol Carter and I'm the founder and CEO of Global Minded. We are all about creating a capable, diverse talent pipeline to get more women, people of color, and all manner of unrepresented talent into the education, economic mobility, and leadership pipeline. And we do this in a number of ways. One is annually through our conference, which has been virtual last year and this year. Next year, however, we want to invite all of you the third week of June to Denver in 2022. We also have a number of leadership programs for students. And this year, that'll be the 14th through the 18th of June. And your students are all invited to join us for the First Gen Leadership Program, where we'll have a program every day at 4 o'clock with some of our graduates who are now in different professions, some people who are in midlife, sharing their inside secrets for the kinds of things they look for in people they hire, and a lot of other insights for students to know what the hidden curriculum is and be able to tap into the networks that are going to be part of who you're going to experience here today in this session. And the other thing we do is every month we have equity sessions. They're led, all of them, by leaders of color, and most of the panelists are also diverse leaders. These are sessions that your students can attend. There's one in K-12, there's one for higher ed, there's one for STEM, there's one for technology, there's one for health, and we have also one for foundations and funders. So those are really communities of practice. So that's an ongoing way that we can work with you outside of our conference. And finally, we have Inclusive Leader Awards every year across 15 sectors. We really believe that until the diversity and inclusion leaders are household names, like sports stars and movie stars, we're not going to have the diversity and inclusion that we need to see represented everywhere. So thank you so much for joining us today. We are delighted that this is part of our Reboot Resilience, Rebound Remarkable coming out of COVID. We're working with the NSF Includes team today, and we are so honored to launch today with an incredible session with President Gregory Washington. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about President Washington. He is president at George Mason University, and he leads the largest and most diverse public university in Virginia, a Tier 1 research university categorized by the Carnegie Classification of Institutions of Higher Ed. He became Mason's 8th president on July 1st, 2020. Dr. Washington, the former dean of the Henry Samuel School of Engineering at the University of California, Irvine, and former interim dean of the College of Engineering at Ohio State University, is regarded nationally as a strategic and collaborative solutions-oriented leader who is committed to providing opportunities for students of all backgrounds. In his 7 years at UCI, Dr. Washington expanded undergraduate enrollment in the engineering school by 1,100 students and graduate enrollment by more than 200. He led a freshman experiential learning initiative that resulted in more than 60% of undergraduate engineering students conducting research. And he established the University of California's first student makerspace and helped establish the OC STEM initiative, one of the nation's first STEM ecosystems. So it's no surprise why he was chosen to be the keynote today. And it's my great pleasure on behalf of all of the team here that's helped us put the next few days together to welcome President Gregory Washington. Thank you so much for this time as our keynote to launch us.
Well, it is a pleasure to be here, and I am ecstatic to have an opportunity to address all of you today. I got a presentation here that I'm going to go through, and then afterwards, hopefully there'll be time for some questions. So let me share my screen. Okay, and let's get started here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about creating a climate for post-pandemic success for minorities in engineering. You know, I don't have to tell you all that we have been dramatically disrupted by the pandemic. Currently, there are about 7 million unfilled jobs in the country that were a direct result of the pandemic. It has upended our entire job market. There are literally millions of people who need to be re-educated and retrained, and more than 3 million jobs we know are not coming back. They just won't be here. Even higher education has suffered to date, somewhere in the neighborhood of 690,000 jobs have been lost. But that's just part of the problem. We know that there are large numbers of students who will be entering our universities that must overcome the challenges and the pitfalls of remote learning. And I'll highlight some information on that in a second. And we also know that the pandemic has also highlighted in a very, very stark way racial inequities, not just in the economy and in health, but also in academic issues as well. So if you take a look at the unemployment rate and you look at it for February of 2020 and February of 2021, the first thing, the good news here is that we actually see improvement, right? Unemployment has gotten better from February 20 to February 2021 for most groups. If you start to look at it very, very closely, you start to see some very interesting pieces of information. For a Caucasian student with less than high school degree, right? You see that their unemployment rate is somewhere in the neighborhood of, if you look at the 2 years together, over that 2-year period, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 12%. That number is the same for an African-American student who actually has some college. So actually has a high school degree and actually has taken some college. You can see the disparities run true for all different levels. It's a really interesting thing to see. But the shining light here is that for all ethnic groups, no matter what walk of life you come from, overall employment rates actually decline with increased education. You see, education is the key to all of this. Look, the top 25% wage earners in our country nearly all go to college, 77% of them. So if I took that top 25%, 77% of them go to college, and that made a huge difference in the pandemic. If we're going to talk about how do we perform in a post-pandemic society, we have to have an understanding of what the pandemic did to us. What has the pandemic done to us as a country? Well, we do know that millions of people had to go to online learning. And the percentage of Latino and Black students who were in online learning is much higher than it is for the overall average. You can see the data there. And because in the K-12 ranks, a large proportion of students of color have been in online learning, we actually now can correlate that to actual learning loss. So if you look there at the plot on the right, if your school district resumed instruction by fall 2020, right? So the pandemic basically shut everything down in March or so of 2020. If your school system resumed by the fall, your learning loss was about 3.1 months. But that's not what happened in most of the country. Most of the country, it was delayed until the next year, some in January, in which cases your learning loss was 6.8 months. And a number of school districts across the country, a number here in Virginia, where I'm sitting now, did not resume or will not resume full instruction until fall of 2021. And those students have what we are now calling the lost year. 12.1 months of loss. And so when you look at what has happened with the fact that students of color have had more online learning, they've actually had more loss. And this is a real challenge going forward. We also see that when you look at deaths, people of color have had to deal with more death related to the pandemic. And these are deaths per 100,000 people. There have been just more deaths in those BIPOC communities. And what does that have to do with higher ed? What does that have to do with graduating from college with a degree? Well, the reality is that there's going to be a tremendous amount of trauma in these communities as they return to universities and to high school. And we're actually literally seeing that currently as we speak. Look, the net result is everything that I've highlighted to you are all systemic related issues, right? And our country struggles with the whole systemic racism related issues. We understand racist very easily, right? So I've shown here an iceberg, and on the top of that iceberg, you see entities like hate crimes and hate speech and neo-Nazi groups and the use of the N-word and KKK. We can all identify that as issues that emanate from racist. What I contend to you is that the more difficult issues to deal with are the issues that are under the iceberg, right? These are issues like Jim Crow laws that are creeping back up in voting as we see today. These are issues in dealing with the fact that there are a number of states currently that don't have hate crime laws, at least 3. When you deal with racist mascots, the use of the Confederate flag and entities like that, these things cut just as deep. In many cases, they're more troubling, but the society doesn't see them in the same sense like they see the issues above the iceberg. But it's really the below the iceberg that's systemic. Those systemic issues that I've highlighted here, a whole host of them, that's what correlates, and that's what gives you the outcomes that you saw on the previous slides. So these are issues that we have to deal with post-pandemic. We also have to deal with unprecedented change. Look, I'm an engineer, and I like to look at years of 50 million users as a way to highlight change. It took radio 38 years, television 13, cell phone 7, internet 4. It took Facebook only 2 years to get to 50 million users. How many of you got a Facebook account? And a few years ago, we had this huge nationwide thrust of Pokemon Go. It took Pokemon Go 3 weeks. 3 weeks to get to 50 million users. It took Fortnite, which I know a number of you that are listening to this talk probably play. It took Fortnite less than 2 weeks to get to 50 million users. So we see that the speed of change of adoption is increasing and increasing at a dramatic rate. So what that means for us is that events, outcomes that may have taken a month, 10 years, 5 years, are happening in a much shorter period of time now than they were 5, 10 years ago. And we should think about that as we think about outcomes for our future. Look, I can break it down to you like this. Things are changing so fast that more than half of the top 10 in-demand jobs today didn't exist 10 years ago. They just wasn't here. Look, Google became a publicly traded company in 2008. The first iPhone, the one that has all of the, that doesn't have a keyboard, that had a virtual keyboard and the like. That was invented in 2007. There were no apps to speak of before 2007, 2008, right? You were talking about Wi-Fi. Back in the early 2000s or so, a good bit of our country was still using dial-up. This is the change in the speed which we've seen, and whole new job classifications have erupted. Here's what we do know. Over the next 5 years, there will be new job classifications that will come into play. Old ones will be replaced. And we have to prepare you for those jobs when they currently do not exist. That's what the rate of change means. You start your undergraduate degree, you graduate with your undergraduate degree, and when you're coming out of that undergraduate degree, whole new fields of endeavor have popped up that didn't exist when you started. That is what the rate and the speed of change means for all of us. Look, and this change is real. Over the next 5 years, most of the following will become obsolete. Physical IDs, paper currency. You're seeing the growth of cryptocurrency all over. Credit cards, store cards, business cards, photos. Most photos now are not paper, they're electronic. Mail or mail delivery. Hard copies of books. Many of you in classes and the like can consume all of your books and your needs for classes electronically. Bills and notices. Well, it's a misnomer. You will always have bills. They just won't be paper, but you'll always have them. Paper will not be needed and will be obsolete. Steering wheels, right? At some point in time, you will get in your car, there just won't be a steering wheel there. Look, here's what we know. Every year, the automobile manufacturers, and I've done work in this space myself, take a little bit more autonomy away from the driver, right? So now your vehicle was, if you bought a fairly new car, has lane avoidance in it. It has protections in it to keep it from crashing, and the car will take over from you when a crash or a likely crash is imminent. Vehicles do this. Well, 5 years ago, vehicles did not. And 5 years from now, you will have less autonomy with your vehicle than what you have now. Now you can put your vehicle on the highway, and mine, I can put in a setting and it'll drive itself on the highway. I don't have to touch the steering wheel. So that's the kind of thing that's coming, and soon you won't need the steering wheel at all. And then there's classrooms. The pandemic has taught us that, to be totally honest with you, we don't need them. And the studies are now showing that students want to be in school. They want to be at the university, but they don't necessarily want to be in class, especially a class that's at 8 o'clock in the morning. I know somebody feels me when I say that. But we're moving to something much more when we talk about change. Look, there is a technology called CRISPR-Cas9, or just CRISPR. It involves taking a piece of RNA, a chemical messenger, so to speak, that's designed to target a section of DNA, and an enzyme called nuclease that can snip unwanted genes out and paste in new ones. So if you want a kid that won't get bald, has a tremendously high IQ, is 6'5", tremendously intelligent, and runs a 4.5 40, you can impart those genes. You think that that is something of science fiction and not real? They're already using CRISPR-Cas9 technology for dogs. Some of the animals that they've created with this is actually quite frightening. The jump to humans is, ethically is challenging, but and philosophically is challenging, but technically it's not. And so you're going to see this at some point in your lifetimes. So from a post-pandemic perspective, our way of life, our economy, and our relationships will all be more virtual. Look, here's what we've seen. All of the change I've highlighted to you before took place before the pandemic. Here's what we've seen after it. So it took 20 years for e-commerce to get to 18% of retail. Since the pandemic began, it grew to 28%, and that was in 8 weeks. So you had a decade of change of e-commerce in 8 weeks. We're going to keep most of that. We will be using more e-commerce in the future, even once we get back totally to normal, right? If you're an online grocery store, you've seen 6 years of acceleration in just 8 weeks. And I don't have to tell many of you on this call that working from home has actually seen 10 years of acceleration in just 2 weeks, because we all immediately went working to working from home. And the reality is that a lot of this is going to stay, which means that whole new job classifications are going to be created and whole new job classifications are going to go away. And then I couple that, and this is why this discussion is important. If you couple that with what we know is going to happen with our students, that there will be significant demographic challenges starting in the year 2025. We're literally going to start to see dramatic enrollment drops throughout the globe and really throughout our colleges and universities here in the US. You're going to see this sharp drop happening after 2025, and the declines in some states will be double digits, 15 to 20% declines in the number of eligible college students. And so when you look at all of the challenges in front of us and the fact that our economy is changing, you need much more people in high-tech fields. This is going to be the biggest problem we will be dealing with as a planet. The Chinese have already started to address this. They have now gone, they quietly went from only allowing families to have one kid to having two. Now they've released that from having two to having three just over the past couple of months, because this is going to be a global demographic shift, and the pandemic has sped it up. How do we know the pandemic has sped it up? Because birth rates across the planet are down by double digits in every single country, including the US. You would have thought with all these people being locked up in confined places with one another, birth rates would go up. But that is not what has happened. They've actually gone down, and they've gone down dramatically. If I were to look at what's going to happen over the next 5 to 6 years in academic parlance, meaning looking at what's going to happen at universities across our country, we see that different states will be hit differently. This is a kind of a messy set of charts, but let me just highlight it to you. Stripes are really, really bad. That means that if the stripes are diagonal stripes, that means that there's going to be greater than a 15% decline in the total number of students in that particular group. Just these are individuals who are of college age. If the colors are solid colors, then there's going to be growth. Stripes are bad, solids are good. So look at where the stripes are, right? And if you think about where the engineering focused states are, the manufacturing states, the high-tech states, they're all the states in stripes. Look at it. That's where you're going to see dramatic double-digit drops in enrollment, just because the pie is shrinking. There's less, there'll be less students graduating from middle school and less students graduating from high schools, because there are less middle school students currently in those areas. So those institutions who have built themselves on non-Hispanic white students, they're going to have real problems finding students at their universities. Now, if you're focused more on Hispanic students, you actually have some hope. You can see the numbers there across the country. You see significant growth on Latinx and Hispanic students, even also on Asian and Pacific Islander students. But look at the number for African American students. It's mixed. Some states, they're growing. In some states, there's dramatic shrinkage. And so we're going to have to think about our recruitment, our retention strategies in a very, very different way. And we're going to have to do it really, really soon. So what are strategies for post-pandemic success? Look, I've tried to be as stark as possible, highlighting to you the challenges that I see coming our way. And because what I'm going to project as the solutions are equally stark. Look, we need a moonshot-sized K-12 outreach and engagement framework, right? That means company foundations, NSF, Department of Ed, Department of Energy, DOD, universities, and the nonprofit sector must all work together to triple the number of successful programs in the STEM pipeline, okay? And when I say successful, I'm gonna highlight to you, my philosophy in this has always been, we actually know what works. We know the programs that work, that retain students at universities, that get them through. We need to expand those programs, and I'm gonna highlight some of them as I talk. We need to meet students where they are. A much larger number of students in our country right now are actually in community colleges, much more so than four-year colleges. So we need systems in place that transition them to four-year when necessary, or that transitions them to jobs out of the two-year institutions and community colleges where they exist. Believe it or not, that mechanism is not very well defined as of current. At Mason, we have the largest program in our state. We currently have about 3,000 students in our advanced program. It is a pipeline program where a student can start at one institution at community college, and they can graduate from George Mason with about no loss in actual degree. I'm going to talk about it in detail here coming up. And then we need to establish upskilling and reskilling programs. And these programs have to be based on certificates and badges, not degrees, right? Because you got a large number of people who are currently displaced who need jobs. And then finally, we actually have to develop mechanisms to partner with employers in a very significant way. So I mentioned to you earlier that we got to scale programs that work. Look, that means there are a whole host of programs that we know historically that have worked extraordinarily well, from bridge programs to 100% student needs scholarship-based programs, culturally relevant recruitment, faculty development, facilitated study groups. These are the things that we know have worked and have worked incredibly well, but we're not scaling them properly right now in our country, right? One of the most successful programs that I know is the Meyerhoff program that was really out of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Extraordinarily successful. They've produced more than 1,200 PhDs and master's students in engineering over the last 20 years, more than 1,200. It's one of the most successful programs of its type. It works extraordinarily well. Why isn't that program replicated to be one in every state? Why isn't there not at least 15 Meyerhoff programs? We don't need to go through a competition for this. Just take that program, fund it, and replicate it. Look, who builds a stock portfolio with all new programs? We're always searching for new ideas. No, you build a stock portfolio based on programs that work, and then a small number of new programs, because you do want to stoke the pipeline with new programs and new initiatives, but it's a small number. It's not the majority, right? And so let's take the things that work, let's scale them. Later on in this program, you're going to have Howard Adams, who is one of my heroes. And Howard Adams was the person that basically put the GEM program, the Graduate Education for Minorities program, on the map. Produced hundreds of PhDs. Most of the most successful individuals of African-American descent in science and engineering, of Latino descent in science and engineering that you see in this country actually came through GEM. If you sit down with folks and start asking them, you'll see Why isn't that program expanded 2, 3, 4-fold? Why hasn't the National Science Foundation or these other entities put an includes program around that? Just take that program, make it the includes, one of the includes entities, and expand it and make it work. Look, we know it works. Why not expand it and grow it? I'm going to highlight 2 programs at George Mason University that I think represent outstanding models, and then I'm going to step off the stage here. The first is our advanced pathway, right? And so what we learned in Virginia is that community college students accumulate nearly a semester's worth of credit by the time they earn a bachelor's degree, and many of them were not earning bachelor's degrees. They would go to community college, they would wind up in a 4-year and they wouldn't get out. Only 15% were actually making it with a bachelor's degree within 7 years. And so we put in place the advanced program to really spend time with those students and shorten that pathway. And so we've been able to increase the number of Northern Virginia Community College graduates. We've been able to increase the time to graduate. They actually graduate in 4 years, and that leads to dramatically decreasing the cost and improve support. And how did we do it? We did it with a plethora of support to the students, from success and coaching to flexible and online class offerings. We streamlined the financial aid process. You apply at the community college, and that financial aid follows you all the way through the 4-year institution. We basically treat those community college students like they're George Mason students. They can use our libraries. They can use many of the George Mason University facilities, even though there's at a community college. They feel like they're Mason students, and it's worked dramatically well. The program right now has current enrollment. That was actually last year's enrollment of 1,800. We're approaching 3,000 students now. Look at the top pathways. Look at the degrees that these students are choosing: cybersecurity, business administration, nursing, science, right? These are the kinds of things that the students are moving towards in terms of outcomes. And so what we've seen is that the outcomes have been extraordinarily successful. Here's one of the things that we recognize in the program. Our current graduation rate is about 71% for students who start as freshmen and graduate. In this program, those students who start and matriculate is over 80%. So the students actually are not students who would normally get into Mason, but they actually do better over time. So it's a significant outcome. Another program I'll highlight is what we call the Mason Talent Exchange. And look, the issue here is that employers right now are looking for talent. They want talent with high quality credentials, but they want talent also with experience. And so this talent exchange, what it has done is we've identified what the employer needs from what they've been posting in job postings. So we look at their job postings and say, here are all the areas that local employers need. We take a set of micro credentials that we align with those needs based on what companies have been, saying they need, because they've been asking for it in the workforce. And then we couple a partnership with the company where the companies actually interview the people after they get the micro credentials from Mason. It has worked extraordinarily well. It is producing tens to 20s of jobs per month. Currently, we're cycling people through this program. It's one of the kinds of solutions that I think we're going to have to come up with in the end. Look, what do all these companies have in common? And this is kind of, as I wrap up here, this is why I don't really feel too challenged that we're going to figure this out. What do all these companies have in common? I'm talking about companies like Google and Genentech and Yahoo and Microsoft and eBay and Apple. What do they have in common? Their founders were all in their teens and 20s. And so if you fit that age group and you're on this call, this is your legacy and lineage. This is what the last generation has done. And It's what generations of Americans have always done. And the feeling is that you will do the same, right? If you're in your 40s or 50s like me, when we hadn't started one of these, you probably underachieved, but that's a different story. Look, the reality of the situation is, despite our competitors, we've always figured out a way in America. If I look at the great achievements of the last century, from electrification to the airplane, to the internet, to automobiles, to highways, all of those outcomes have come from the West, primarily from the United States. And in 1900, the US population was 76 million and China's was 467 million. That's 6 times larger than ours, okay? If you go back to 2020, that difference has shrunk dramatically. So it's not about how many people you have, it's about what you do with them. And America is still innovating. We still are putting out great companies, great technologies all over, and it continues to happen. And look, the reality is we are still rising to the occasion, and I hope that you all will see that as well. And so on that note, I'm gonna stop sharing and open up for questions.
Thank you. And Cindy, I'm going to ask you, I've got the student questions. Should we do a combination of the student questions for President Washington? And then there are some questions in the Q&A. So you guide us as to how you'd like us to frame this for him.
Thank you, Carol. Let's do the student questions first, and then let's try to fit in some of those Q&As.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. And fascinating keynote. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm a big believer, if we just get out of the way of young people, there are so many different things that they can be doing. So co-creating the future. So here's the first question from our students. What are the developmental supports that minority institutions can provide to students who have insufficient proficiency upon entry to college? And what can universities do to improve the student success before they get into college?
So, look, I will tell you the most important is what I highlighted. Some of the programs that I highlighted when we talk about our advanced program. The most important that I've seen is success coaching, in almost a semi-personalized manner, but having individuals engage with students early. So early identification of students that have needs, and then success coaching them, working with them through the needs that they have and helping guide them to towards getting a degree, getting a 4-year degree, staying with them and guiding them. It's really interesting. The difference between a person who has gotten a PhD in mechanical engineering and a person who drops out, enters into a life of drugs, and winds up incarcerated is literally a choice. And I can tell you that because I've experienced it. I experienced it personally. I was not the smartest kid in my cohort group growing up in New York City. There were other kids who were just as smart or smarter than I was. The difference between them and I is that we actually made different decisions. We made different choices at key points in our lives. Success coaches help you make the right choice. And that's why they're so important.
I think that's a key point. The other thing I saw on your slide was Summer Bridge. And I think that's such a critical, and it kind of goes hand in hand too with the success coaches. So
this is right, because Summer Bridge, it's an ideal mechanism to have, because Summer Bridge programs happen before students touch foot on your campus, and it gives them an opportunity to adjust before the rigors of the actual academic lifestyle kick in, right?
Yeah.
That has been tremendously successful. But guess what? Less than half of the universities in the country use them.
I know it. And I just look at it from an employer standpoint, and I say, if you can't anticipate and plan for your strengths and weaknesses, how are you going to deal with those things? So I just think it's such a basic employment skill to teach students as well at that stage.
If the National Science Foundation provided resources to expand summer bridge programs across the country through a cost share model, that would have a greater effect on outcomes than 10 or 15 of the programs that they actually fund on an ongoing basis. It is that profound, and it is of all of the different programs that we should scale and work. Next to coaching, Summer Bridge is probably the most important.
Okay, now Cindy and Steve and the rest of you, we're going to take that under advisement, and we're going to put President Washington's vision into an SF proposal, because I think that is critical everywhere. Here's another question from the students. What advice can you give graduating students transitioning from college to professional careers in the post-pandemic era? Also, how should one go about networking for internships and industrial opportunities for entry-level positions in this time of social distancing? Where should students be looking to gain experience required for entry-level positions that then can give way to higher earning power?
So the great thing is you would think that because we're in an environment that doesn't allow or didn't allow as much travel, you couldn't get around as much, that you would be hampered in being able to network and engage. But that's actually not necessarily the case. Virtual networking and virtual engagements and virtual interviews have skyrocketed. And so you can connect through your local NSBE chapter to any of the regional or national conferences through their SHIP, Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers chapter. You can you can through MIAS, through lots of different ACEs, through lots of different organizations. And here's a group. Here's something interesting. At the institutions that I've been involved with, we didn't care what group you came from. If you were involved with us, we'd send you to all of them. So we would send African American students to go to the SHIP conference. We'd send Latinx students to the NSBE conference. We'd send white students to the SHIP conference and to the NSBE conference, and they would get jobs, right? Because companies are looking for talent. And so that's one of the areas I would start. The great thing is, no matter what quarter of the year you're talking about, one of those groups has a major conference framework. And they usually offer, meaning they have a major conference that actually all have in them for lack of a better way of putting this, a recruitment session, right? A job fair type session. And I would just connect to the virtual ones. So that's the easiest way to do it. The other way is to connect through your career planning and placement centers at your institutions. Utilize those. It's interesting. The students who utilize those less tend to be our underrepresented students. The students that utilize them the most are our foreign students. They will flood those areas and they get jobs. And so, I get that it's some work. So most of the time you got to fill out a pre-application form and all that, but you should do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I so agree. We say, like, that's global minded. You have to be an inclusive leader, as well as a leader who's a woman or a leader who's Latino or whatever else. You have to be able to draw on all of those different things.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. Okay, here is another one, and then we'll go to some of the ones that are in the Q&A from the people attending. This is another student question. How can minority institutions ensure that students have experiential opportunities and hands-on lab experiences, which were difficult during the pandemic? So some of these people might be looking at how can they make up for some lost time.
Interestingly enough, most institutions did have some they labs operated, they used the virtual environment to do more hands-on. So I would take advantage of those. The other piece is check with your local community college. You'll be surprised what's being offered at community colleges. You may be able to find classes that actually will transfer in your major that you can take in person that are hands-on.
Well, and I just want to acknowledge the brilliant work you're doing with the NOVA system and how you welcome those students and have them feel at home at your campus. And I think that should be done, across the country, everywhere with community college students. It's really fantastic. So here is an anonymous question, which is about your presentation. Is the focus more on undergraduate or graduate? And can you share some research about minority STEM graduate students, maybe not shared in the workshop handout?
Okay, the last part dropped out there for a second.
Okay, just if you can share some research about some minority STEM graduate students that maybe wasn't in the workshop handout.
So as far, look, here's what I can tell you, and I'm kind of winging it here, so I don't know the exact information that you are quite looking for. But I have done a lot of work in this space over the years. And here's what I will know. Here's what I'll tell you. For women, for Latinx, and for African-American students, the numbers of students matriculating towards advanced degrees has been fairly flat for 20 some odd years. And when you look at it in absolute terms, meaning when you normalize it for African Americans and even for Latinx, it is declining. You'll hear people say, "Oh no, the Latinx numbers are going up," but they fail to look at the fact that the numbers of Latinx students who are of college age is going up more than the numbers of those who are going up in grad school. So when you normalize it, you see that they are actually declining too. African-American numbers are definitely declining, but flat to declining, meaning that the declines are not stark, but they're definitely going down. We're seeing numbers for women start now to tick upwards, but really not at a high rate, and definitely not at the rate where they're represented in society. And so we need to do more. We need more programs and efforts focused in those areas. So I hope that's an answer to your question.
That's great, thank you. Here's another one, which is they've heard the term minorities is not culturally attuned, and wonder if your choice of this term versus other terms to describe minorities, any guidance you might have for them.
So there is a lot of discussion on this one, and I agree with the person putting in this question. It's not a good term to use per se, because people from these underrepresented groups tend to be globally have higher numbers than people from non-underrepresented groups. So when you look at it from a global perspective, they're not minorities at all. And so I get the back and forth. I understand it very well. When you're dealing with a mixed group of people who you don't know their backgrounds or their understanding, you look for a term, you look for terms, and you got a short window, and I'm not face-to-face where I can talk to you. You look for terms that can be broadly accepted by people from many different groups. I will contend to you, what we call it is not the issue, in my opinion, is what we do about it. And, we get too locked into the labels and the titles and less locked into the programmatic thrust, the things that have to be done in order to improve outcomes for students of color. And that's where I've chosen to focus in this regard.
And that's a perfect lead into this next question, which are, what were some of the main challenges that you faced when you set up the community college George Mason pipeline?
Well, the biggest one, to be honest with you, was just acceptance from the current faculty at the institution. The faculty, you know, there is a hierarchy to university professor thinking, and it's a wrong one, but it exists. Getting people to buy into the fact that A, that these students can cut it, and B, that they can be on the, you know, given the right training and background, they can be as good as any students that were currently accepted into the institution was the biggest challenge.
Yeah. Thank you for that. This one is from Swan saying, thanks for your presentation, ! And beyond putting dollars into scaling successful efforts, what other attributes of individuals, groups, and programs are needed to be successful in scaling this work?
You know, dollars is one thing. If you were to say, okay, outside of dollars, you actually need just more people and volunteers. We need more folk. If you think about, when you talk about scaling programs, you'll be surprised what you can do with volunteers, especially students who have come through and have been successful. We all have students like that on our campus. Getting those students involved and engaged such that they can then be a part of the programmatic efforts to help other students go forward. You don't have to give those students money. There are lots of things, benefits you can give them. You can give them prioritized scheduling, which is one of the things we do. You can actually give them credit. You know, credit counts, right? And so there are lots of things that you can do to make up for the financial aspect, given that the financial aspect, you know, may not be equally available to all.
So true. We say too, at Global Minded, it's a lot about working with uncommon collaborators. Not all the people you're used to working with are going to be able to give you those 10x outcomes. So you have to really broaden your circles to different kinds of collaborations that can really make that happen, mobilize that. Here is a question. This woman says, why should we blame it on students? They are not at the right level or whatnot. Why don't we make the entrance requirements more level for all kinds of entries so that you're not limited with your high school location opportunities that were given to you, not to some other students? That's definitely a zip code issue.
No, and she's right. Look, the reality of the situation is, look, so George Mason is an access institution. And so we don't admit everybody, but we're very, very close to it. And one of the goals that I have here is to drive that number as close to zero as possible. I don't think there should be any barriers to getting into a four-year institution. It's to me, and I know I got other university folk on the line who will be coming forward. I think it's the biggest challenge we have is that universities themselves are not inclusive enough, right? We have to be more open to people who may not have had the benefit of zip code. They may not have the benefit of background. And that's why these community college partnerships are important, because that's a training ground that allows individuals at much lower cost to be able to catch up, so to speak. And so, but we have to provide an opportunity to every individual in our states, in our respective states, especially if we're public, every individual in our respective states who needs it or who wants it.
Yeah. Okay, and it looks like this is the last one, which is, how do you reconcile the statements about the lost year with also the statements that classrooms themselves were on the list of things that will be obsolete? Well,
so you know, this is a really good question. The reality of the fact is, I see this differently from a K-12 frame standpoint than I do from a university standpoint. And so there are definitely challenges with K-12 education and how K-12 prosecuted online study. And we know the data from that is coming back and it's real. And it shows a whole host of challenges and issues. And they're not just classroom related. Some of them deals with access. It deals with what kind of environment you have at home. It deals with a lot of different things that don't necessarily show up, from your grade, so to speak, right? That don't necessarily show up in the classroom because they're external, exogenous to the classroom. At a university, we have much greater control over many of those variables, right? We have control over what our dorm environment looks like. We have control over the atmosphere that many of our students encounter, and they have much more control than what some of those same individuals have in their communities. In fact, for us as an institution, we kept a substantial portion of our campus open because it was A, safer, and B, a more conducive learning environment for a significant number of our students, a few thousand. It was a better learning environment and a safer environment for them to remain on campus than it was for them to go into their homes, even during the pandemic. So we kept the campus open and just put mechanisms in place to keep those students safe because we recognize that. And so this is how I reconcile it. It's environment. That's a big portion of that decline in performance. And if you can control that environment, it's better. Here's what we saw at the university. We had pretty good success with our virtual offerings. About 2/3 of the students did well. There's about 1/3 of the students that struggled. That's not an acceptable number for us. But it's a number, that 2/3 number told us that it's a number that we can build upon. And we have seen students who actually struggled, and here's the interesting point, who struggled in face-to-face actually thrived in the online. We're still trying to get an understanding as to why that is the case, but the data shows it. So these are areas that it's gonna require some more study, but I can tell you unequivocally that our students here, and I don't know what it is at other institutions, our students are telling us with their feet when we give them the choice of a virtual class now or that same class in person, the virtual sections fill up faster and quicker, and the in-class person sections, fill up slower, don't even fill up. That's what we're actually seeing, and we're seeing it across multiple disciplines. Doesn't matter if you're STEM, it doesn't matter if you're not STEM. It's actually a real phenomenon that we're going to have to, as academics, take a hard look at.
Wow. Well, fabulous. And we are just within about a minute to the top of the hour. But Dr. Washington, it's been incredible to spend the hour with you, and your presentation was fabulous. But I also think it was really wonderful to get these questions from the students, and also I think a lot of the faculty who are in attendance today. So thank you so much for your time. And I'm going to send it over to Cindy, and we will follow up with you and your leaders at George Mason and make sure we can continue this work through the Global Minded Community and Network, and very much look forward to it. And again, so appreciate you making time to launch us here over the next 3 days.
Thank you all. Look forward to engaging with you in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. And thank you to Carol for a wonderful moderation. I'm glad we got to all those questions, Carol.
Thank you,
so
Carol.
much.